So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon for this Thriving Lives for Armed Forces Children CPD conference for schools, particularly for Scottish schools, but not exclusively today. So my name is Jill Hampson, and you might be wondering who I am and what I have to do with this. I work as a researcher for the International Centre for Guidance Studies, and I have been working with the team and the SCIP Alliance, so the Service Children Progression Alliance, to do research on the Thriving Lives toolkit and try and work out what needs to be done to develop it further for use with Scottish schools. And then also starting to think about when schools do use this, what impacts does that have? Primarily with a view to continuing to develop our work and help those armed forces children further. So today we have a fantastic panel of speakers for you. You're going to hear briefly from me just for a little bit. Hang on, the slides have just disappeared. So I will talk you through a privacy statement, and then that will be followed by Moira Leslie, who's the Education Manager at the Royal Caledonian Education Trust. We were due to have David Ferguson, the Senior Policy Officer from the Scottish Government, with us today, but unfortunately he's not able to attend. So Carolyn McLeod, MBE, National Transitions Officer for Scotland, is going to cover David's presentation and her own. And then we will hear from Phil Dent, who's the SCIP Alliance Director. Finally, we'll hear from Kath Lawrence, who's head of the SCIP Alliance. We also have a breakout room session where it gives schools, people from schools and our other participants an opportunity to talk with each other about what they've learned, practice that goes on in their own schools, share thoughts and feedback. And during that, I have to let you know that ISEGs are continuing to collect data. So as part of this event today, we'll be listening into what our participants have to say about the issues that they face, the practices that they have, and the support that they might need. So we'll be collecting data during this conference, and we'll be doing that in 3 ways. Firstly, via polls. So occasionally you'll see a slide pop up with a question on it, and there'll be a number of different answers, and then a little box will appear on your screen, and you just click on the number of the answer that best represents how you feel. That data is captured anonymously, so nobody knows your response, not even me. It aggregates the data, and we see that at the end. The other thing that we'll be doing is listening to you in breakout rooms. So we have some questions about the sorts of things that you do in schools. It's an opportunity for you to share practice, and if that's all right with you, we'll be taking some notes and collecting information about what you've said. Finally, the messages in the group chat, if you are adding information to discussions via the group chat, that will also be downloaded. Anything that's said in the group chat or during the breakout rooms will be anonymised, and no information that you provide will be attributed to you or your organisation. That being said, if you don't want your data to be used for this research, if you just indicate that in the chat box at the side, then we'll know to extract it from the data. Okay, so this is our first polling question. Let's see if I can just get back to... Okay, so has your school accessed additional funds or grants that are directed towards armed forces children? So I'm going to start the poll now. If you indicate your response there, 1 for yes, 2 for no, or 3 for I don't know. Okay. And polling question 2, if you do receive funding, what do you use it for? 1, funding for staff members, 2, funding for resources such as IT. 3, funding for external organisations to provide support. 4, all or some of those. Or number 5, none of those. Okay, so that's interesting and something for us to follow up on. So I'm going to hand you over now to Moira Leslie, Education Manager at the Royal Caledonian Education Trust. Over to you, Moira.
Thank you, Jill. As Jill said, I'm the Education Manager of the RCT, but I also co-chair the Skip Alliance, the Scotland Hub, with Tracy Kerr from Heriot-Watt University. I would like to add my welcome and thanks for attending today, because we all know that it's such a busy time for everybody. We have some apologies today for people who can't make it today with us, but who wanted to be there, and will listen to the recordings before our session for next week. I just want to make a couple of things before I hand over to the presenters themselves. And I wanted to mention about the toolkit itself, and to just reassure you that the toolkit is genuinely a UK resource. Millie Taylor, my colleague from Wales, and I have been involved with Skip Alliance for many, many years, and our voices are always listened to when we talk about the context for Scotland and for Wales, and this has been very evident in the development of the toolkit. So this is not an English resource solely, it is truly a UK-wide resource. The other thing I wanted to mention briefly was the use of terminology, because by its very name, the Skip Alliance obviously favours service children, and that's the terminology favoured in England and Wales. In Scotland, I'll get rid of this slide, I think. In Scotland, we favour the terminology armed forces, or children and young people from armed forces families. What I would want to say to you today is you'll hear both these sets of terminology used interchangeably as we go through the events. And I would ask you not to get hung up on the terminology, because it doesn't matter whether we use service children, it doesn't matter whether we use armed forces. What does matter is that we keep the fact that, first and foremost, they are children and young people and learners, and that's what we're here for. If you haven't already done so, please introduce yourself in the chat function and post any questions or comments throughout the whole event. These questions will be picked up in our Q&A session at the end. We may not be able to answer all the questions, but what I will reassure you is that all the questions will be collated and the responses will be circulated after the event. Jill did mention the fact that David Ferguson from Scottish Government is not able to join us today, but I wanted to say that David is extremely supportive of Skip Alliance and of the Thriving Lives Toolkit. I think Blackboard was probably an issue for him, and I have to say, when I think of the word Blackboard, the last time I used Blackboard, the only thing I had in my hand was a piece of chalk. So today is very, very different. But I am delighted now to introduce Caroline McLeod. Caroline, for many of you, or if not most of you, needs no introduction at all as NTO working with AGES. And I'm very, very grateful to Caroline, because she has agreed at very short notice to merge David's presentation with her own presentation. So over to you, Caroline.
Thank you, Moira. Together, David and I prepared this segment to outline the landscape for armed forces children and young people in Scotland. And David has provided his own slides and notes, which, as Moira mentioned, I will present. If there are any questions, please add them to the chat section. This presentation will provide a brief overview of these areas, aware that many in the audience will be familiar with some. The Act creates a purposefully broad definition of additional support needs, ASN. This covers a range from permanent long-term conditions such as physical disabilities and neurodevelopmental differences to short-term temporary barriers such as dealing with loss or upheaval. We know that deployments and moves can cause anxiety and stress in families and in children and young people. The broad definition of additional support needs means that support can be provided to these children and young people if and when they need it, for however long they require it. It is important to note that this does not assume that children from armed forces families always have additional support needs. The universal support offered by school staff may be sufficient to meet their needs. Also important to note is that formal diagnosis is not required to access support. Barriers to learning are not always a formally diagnosed condition or illness. The school should be the first port of call for all questions or concerns about additional support needs and any support required. Further information will be available from the local authority as well as other groups, Forces Children's Education, Inquire, My Rights, My Say, etc. Angela Morgan was asked to conduct a review of the Additional Support for Learning Act and how successfully it had been implemented across Scotland. There was a mixed picture, some excellent practice in supporting children and young people, and some practice requiring development. There was acknowledgement that policy frameworks are robust, but delivery is not consistent across Scotland. Following the review, the Scottish Government, COSLA, ADES, agreed an action plan to take steps to improve the implementation of additional support for learning. Work is underway to implement this, including a review of coordinated support plans. We know armed forces families often have concerns about information about their child moving from school to school. We are also updating the Code of Practice, the statutory guidance accompanying the Additional Support for Learning Act. In consultation with stakeholders, this will include more specific, detailed guidance on needs of armed forces children and young people, particularly around transitions. Work is also being done to include young people in policy creation and development. The Young Ambassadors for Inclusion have drafted a vision statement, and we intend to involve specific groups of learners, including armed forces children and young people, in relevant discussions. As above, this bill will ask local authorities to consider how they are delivering and designing services in light of these priorities and these principles. The UK government is leading on this bill, but it will apply in the devolved nations. Specific delivery models are not mandated, but they will need to consider how armed forces children and young people are being served in education provision. The MOD and Scottish Government will be engaging stakeholders in Scotland on the statutory guidance that accompanies this soon. Some of the issues this group is working on: data collection on armed forces children and young people, how this can be done effectively and can be used to help meet the needs of children and young people. Safeguarding, ensuring that children and young people are supported and safe as they move within, out of, and into Scotland. Education Support Fund, MOD grants to fund projects benefiting armed forces children and young people. Providing clear and accessible information to armed forces families on the Scottish education system and support available for children and young people. Ensuring that voices of armed forces children and young people are included in policy creation and development. And that's the end of David's slides. If you have any questions, please pop them into the chat section. I am going to continue to build on the foundation of the policy context that David outlined in his slides and in his notes, and add to the diagram of interconnectedness across local authorities, regional improvement collaboratives, and schools. Whether, as Moira mentioned, whether we use the term service children or military children or armed forces children, we are focusing on a distinct group who share some common experiences in life and family. Let me begin with what we know. All of our work and engagement as educators focuses on the child at the center and getting it right for every child. It is important to acknowledge that educators and partnership groups have been working across the landscape in Scotland for years in support of tri-service armed forces families, their children and young people. Work has tended to exist in areas with significant numbers of armed forces families close to visible bases, camps and stations. Over the years, a significant amount of funding has been granted by the MOD Education Support Fund, ESF, and the Armed Forces Covenant Trust Fund to some schools and local authorities, those able to fulfill the criteria. Such projects, in addition to supporting armed forces children and young people and their peers, have also served as examples of good practice and enhanced the skills of staff and support professionals. In the future, we will know of more families spread widely across Scotland. We need to continue to build on the experience and knowledge that is being developed and share it with others, and that is why we're here today. The Scottish education system is unique, yet like all others across jurisdictions of the United Kingdom nations and beyond, it functions best for children and families who remain within the structure. Complexities arise for families, those in the margins, who are mobile, whose children experience interrupted learning, are affected by separation, loss, parental deployment, and other factors. Oops, I don't know if we've slipped forward here on the slides. But I'll continue talking. Importantly, we have a duty to pay attention, identify needs, and provide support around mental health and well-being concerns. Oops, sorry. There we go. ADES, the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, is a professional network of 32 local authorities, directors, and senior leaders. You will recognize ADES as the organisation that works closely with the Scottish Government to provide advice and guidance around key issues, while supporting the development and the knowledge exchange of its members. Some of you will be aware that ADES has networks across many areas of focus: additional support needs, early years curriculum, and others. ADES also promotes the network that supports armed forces children and young people through my role as National Transitions Officer, or NTO. It is the NTO role that facilitates the joining up of effort and oversight of children moving into and out with Scotland, aware of the specific challenges, as just mentioned, that need to be addressed in providing a smooth transition. In the previous Scottish Government slides, David Ferguson has mentioned the Armed Forces Covenant. All 32 local authorities have signed the covenant, and they recognize that it's their responsibility to address the needs of forces children and young people and their families in each and all communities. The MOD, through Armed Forces Covenant, also works to support families. This is essential to ensure the operational readiness of their personnel to respond when required. With a web of network groups, there is a joining up of connectivity through government, local authorities, schools, early years settings and communities in cooperation with the MOD, partnership groups, and third sector. As National Transitions Officer, I also work closely with the MOD Tri-Service on many levels and can engage with their structure to inform and influence collaboration and development. The NTO represents defence to Scottish Government and other national bodies delivering education for armed forces children and young people in Scotland. There have been several recent developments that influence the attention to and engagement with armed forces families and their children. In addition to the development of the legislation, the Armed Forces Covenant Bill, there are reports such as Living in Our Shoes by Andrew Soulis, MP, and research, for example, the impact of service life on the military child by the Naval Children's Charity. Due to the national commitment of ADES, there have been several areas of development. Armed Forces children and young people are on the radar for all directors of education, local authority, children and family services across Scotland, regardless of the number. Every local authority has a nominated lead officer for armed forces families and children. and these lead officers comprise the membership of my ADES Armed Forces Working Group. There is an established National Head Teachers Forum, Tri-Service, and a Professional Leadership Network Group UK across the devolved jurisdictions. ADES has enabled the Armed Forces Families Indicator to be embedded in the National CMIS data management system, working towards a better understanding of who are the Armed Forces children and young people, where are they, and identifying regular reserve and ex-service veteran families. Through ADES, I conducted a data collection in 2019 as a pilot exercise. We have learned a good deal from it and are preparing to undertake another exercise in the next school year. Data such as this is important to ensure informed engagement and relationship building, assessment, and the addressing of gaps, monitoring each child's learning journey, and promoting positive destinations. There is a national website, Forces Children's Education website, that together with the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, provides a first point of contact for families transitioning into, within, and away from Scotland. It's directly linked to the ADES website, linked to local authority and school websites to promote information and contact, including examples of newsletters produced by groups focused on Armed Forces children and young people, and offering resources for educators and families with links to partnership groups, always promoting examples of good and interesting practice. These connections and developments inform and enhance involvement with the Scottish Government, Scottish Armed Forces Education Support Group. It also enables work with Education Scotland, and this includes specific information on the National Improvement Hub, Parent Zone, and GLOW, with partnership groups and third sector organisations such as the Royal Caledonian Education Trust, Scotland's Armed Forces Children's Charity. This background information about the landscape across Scotland is in relation to Armed Forces children and families to reinforce the joined-up nature of people and organisations. This structure of the Scottish education system and support network, aligned with the MOD structure and pattern of engagement, may appear as a rigid framework of communication and collaboration. Yet as educators, we know that flexibility is needed to support children and young people in their development, growth, and learning of skills for life. All of this is facilitated by the people with whom they can engage and nurture a relationship. That flexibility to respond to the needs of the child at the center of our focus stems from a solid knowledge base of information and resources. I believe we have the potential in Scotland to get it right for Forces families. And I invite you to be in contact with me, and will welcome any questions that have been added in the chat. Responses can be provided during the question and answer session unless there are any key points that need clarification before we proceed. And I wonder, Moira, is there anything that we need to address before we move on?
Not at the moment, Caroline, thank you. Not at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for sticking with me. I seem to have given you a whirlwind tour of many more slides than I intended. I apologize. Not quite sure how that happened, but today we can increase our understanding and knowledge with an introduction to the Thriving Lives Toolkit. And I would like to introduce Phil Dent, Director of the Service Children's Progression Alliance.
Just before Phil starts, I'm going to pop up and ask you to respond to a poll question. Do you use external organisations to help provide information or support? And this question is really open to everyone, even if you don't work in a school. 1 for yes, 2 for no. Okay, and if you do use external support organisations, please feel free to add the names of those into the chat box on the side. And then polling question number 4. What does this support help you with? So we've got 1, curriculum issues and addressing gaps, 2, problems relating to transition, 3, problems relating to deployment, 4, effective practice for supporting armed forces children and their families, or 5, all or some of those. And here is your poll. Okay, thank you. And on to you, Phil.
Thanks very much, and let me add my welcome to those you've already received. Thank you for taking the time to find out about the Thriving Lives Toolkit. I know you're here because you care like we do about service children and their thriving lives. And I'm going to spend a very short amount of time just telling you what contribution the Service Children's Progression Alliance makes to that end. But I want to major actually on having a little look at what it is we know about service children's lives and how you can go about helping to improve them. So I'll take a little bit of time to do that, but I want to as quickly as possible, get on to providing an opportunity for you to discuss in small groups your own experiences. And I hope to give you a very simple little framework for thinking about service children's lives and how we might go about improving them. So we'll get onto that as quickly as possible. As I said, as I've been said already, my name's Phil Dent. I lead the Service Children's Progression Alliance, and the Alliance's vision is a very simple one. It's one of thriving lives for service children, and that means that whatever service children's backgrounds, whatever anybody else might think their potential is, and we're not in the habit of seeking to limit that, we are interested in them thriving in whatever it is they have the ambition to do. So we work across the UK to that end, and I'm going to tell you a bit about how we go about doing it. But before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit what we know about the need. There's a sense in which many of you listening are the experts in this, because you will know, as I did when I was working and leading in schools, I was the one who knew my children. I was the one who knew their families. I was the one who knew the communities in which they lived. And I was quite tired of government telling me what I should do with that in response to initiative after initiative. So there's a sense, like I say, in which you are the experts in service children's lives, and our experience tells us that getting as close as you can to individuals and being good at listening, which I'll tell you more about in a minute, is key to supporting them well. So what I'm going to do is kind of give the research and the big picture overview. And the way that we go about characterizing that in the Alliance is through what we call the 4 Ds of service children's lives. And that is, as you can see in front of you here, diversity, discontinuity, development, and disadvantage. Just briefly, then, you'll know that service children's lives, like all children, are unique. They are personal. They are individual. But for service children, there is an additional layer of complexity that can be added on to everything that would be normal for children and young people in their journeys through education and life into thriving adulthoods. And those are characterized very simply through 3 main things, the research tells us. The experiences of separation from family, whether that be serving parents or other wider family. And that can be diverse. It's different for different services, has different patterns. It can include separation through training, as well as what the public might understand as deployment to perhaps a war zone or a theatre, whether that's for support needs or other. So there's a range of ways in which separation can happen, and it affects individuals completely differently. The second one, of course, is mobility. It's often the one that gets the headlines. The prospect of service children living in, say, 8 different homes in the course of a normal school career is not unusual, and of course it can be much, much higher than that. But it also can be the case that a service child is not mobile at all and has a pretty standard experience of school life. But mobility is certainly a factor. And it's something which, again, plays differently in different branches of the services. Again, to generalize, which is something we have to be careful about doing, mobility is something which is greater usually in the Army than it might be in the Navy or the Air Force, but it's also something which in the Army happens often as units or as groups, whereas it might be in the form of trickle postings in the other services where you might move as a family on your own. So there are significant differences there. There's diversity of experience there. And then there's, of course, transition, which in this case, and there's one of the confusions about the work that goes on between military and education contexts, is the different language that we use. transition in this context is the transition of military personnel out of the military back into civilian life, and that can have really interesting and diverse impacts on young people as well. One thing I think that's really important to say about the diversity, the first of the 4 Ds, is that in my mind it's much more of a smoothie than it is a fruit salad. And I think that's a pretty good way of thinking about young people's experiences in general anyway. But in a fruit salad, if you want to pick out the pears and not eat them, or you just eat all of the pineapple first, like my little boys were doing yesterday, then that it makes it very easy to work out, well, which factor is going on, which experience is impacting in which way for this young person. Well, it's not like that. The relationship between separation, mobility, and transition is such a highly personal thing, and so different, extremely personal and unique in every situation. It's much more like the smoothie, where you get a sense of the overall flavor of it, but you could not disaggregate the impacts themselves. And that's why research is so valuable, but it's also why research has limitations, and why it's so important that we focus our attention on helping each other, professionals, supporting young people and their families face to face, to understand their circumstances and support them with as bespoke a response as we possibly can. And that's why many of us in the English system, which is where I've done my teaching practice, often look with envy at Scottish, and even the Welsh system, where a much more individualised and personalised approach to education is the norm. So well done on that front. The second of the 4 Ds is discontinuity. The natural result of all that diversity, that smoothie of experiences, is that there is not a smooth linear process for service children, but that discontinuity is seen in their learning, it's seen in relationships and in opportunities. Curriculum misalignment is a really common experience and something that people spend a lot of time talking about. You'll experience that, I'm sure. It's commonly the case that children will miss entire chunks of the curriculum and do another one 5 times. So service children are often talking to us about the frustration of doing the Vikings for the 5th time and missing a whole chunk of maths, for example. But it's not only about curriculum in terms of the content of the stuff. It can be the experience of moving to a new school where for example, the hires, or in England, the GCSEs, or another context that you were doing at, say, 16 or post-16, they're simply not even taught in the school or the context you move to. And that can be a real concern, of course, learning a particular foreign language or a particular curriculum, for example, in science, and then that being completely different. Notwithstanding, of course, the changes that there are between, for example, the Scottish system and the Welsh system in terms of the years themselves, and children can find themselves missing entire chunks, including whole years of learning. But also opportunities. There can be very long waiting lists for extracurricular opportunities. There can be breakup in the kind of the development journey for sports or other extracurricular activities like arts and music when you don't stay in one place or in a sustained fashion. So there's a huge amount of discontinuity. But the important thing to say at this stage is that diversity and the discontinuity that results, they're value free. There's no sense that that necessarily has to be a bad thing. It looks like a bad thing, and it certainly can be, but the next 2 Ds make a really important distinction. Not everything has to start with D, it just happens to here. The third of the 4 Ds is development. The evidence tells us, and your experience will probably show you as well, that discontinuity can, in some cases, for some children, at some points in their journey, help them to develop a greater adaptability, independence, maturity. When we're interviewing undergraduates, as we find, who come from armed forces families, they're often the ones best prepared for living away from home. They're the ones giving advice and support to their peers who are really missing home and not really knowing how to even manage their own lives. So there's definitely huge amounts of development. And the Alliance takes what we call an asset-based approach to young people. We're not in the business of problematizing young people. We think these people have huge potential. I personally believe the best way to look at potential is that it's limitless, and that we should help young people to do the best they can to achieve their ambitions. But it is also the case that this discontinuity can lead to disadvantage, and it includes some of the things on the left-hand side. At a high level, they're less likely to access higher education. They certainly, if they move a lot, perhaps more than 4 times, we suddenly see a big impact on their attainment. And there are significant impacts on their mental health and well-being, potentially, including hidden caring responsibilities, which the Children's Society have done some fantastic work on, and we're collaborating with them on at the moment. Overall, though, I think the message is one that we need to get as close to the individual to make sure we understand the smoothie of each individual child's life, and make sure that we maximise the opportunity for development and minimise the disadvantage of their experiences. I'd be really interested to hear from you at this point, if you can, in the chat about your own contexts. So if you can tell me if you're from a school, is it a primary school or a secondary school, or are you in a college setting or a university? So just put that in the chat. And if you know, then how many service children do you have in your education setting? Just put that in the chat, and that will help us to understand each other's contexts and inform some of the things that I say as I go on. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about how the Alliance responds to that. Broadly speaking, it's captured really well here. I'm not going to talk in detail about it. You can download our theory of change from our website. But I do want to say one thing, is that while we're focused ultimately on how we can help those who are helping service children, people in schools, universities, colleges, charities who support them, and while that is driven by and supported in terms of its quality by really rigorous research, and while we also work on policy to make sure that the environment we're all working in is really positive, and why we're so pleased to work closely with, for example, with RCET in Scotland, who are doing great work with the Scottish Government on this, and with Carolyn and the NTO role at ADES. The main contribution I believe we make is through strong partnership, helping all those different people who have a stake in supporting service children to work well together. And that's what we're finding makes the biggest impact. We're not the experts in everything. Our job, I think, is to do a good job of helping people collaborate well. And that's, to that end, the Alliance Hub network, which I'll refer to in a moment, is at the heart of everything we do. And we're hugely thankful to RCET for leading that work in Scotland. But we also produce research briefings, which are again developed collaboratively. The Thriving Lives Toolkit is a really good example of how that research and policy leads to good practice, but through collaborative work is translated into actually change in terms of practice and improvements in young people's lives. The thing that matters most, I suppose, is what results of all of that work, and that's also captured in our theory of change. I can see that this is out of date. We've recently launched a 12th hub in the east of England this year, and that is a really great milestone, because we're pretty confident to say there's comprehensive coverage across the UK, and very great opportunities for anyone who engages in those hubs. And let me encourage you to do that in Scotland with a range of people who share the same mission, which is thriving lives for service children. But activities like Creative Forces, which are university experiences days tailored to service children, where we get to hear service children's voices, and service children get the opportunity to speak back to their schools and tell them more about how they can help them to thrive, are a really good example. And the work we do with UCAS is a good example of how we're influencing policy to improve our understanding. They're still planning to introduce a marker for service children, so that when filling out going through the access to HE process, they can identify that they are a service child and have that background. And we're really pleased that from the result of the research that we've done, the Scottish Government sees service children as a target group within their outcome agreement guidance. That's our theory of change, and like I said, you can download that from the website if you take a look there, and you'll see examples of everything I've described in the practice, research and policy fields on that. And if you want to know more, please get in touch with the hub or get in touch with us directly. I'd be pleased to help you with that. Thanks for sharing in the chat your context. I can see there are some really large populations in the areas that we've got engaged, which is really good, because I know that means that, one, we've got some really great expertise amongst us, but also you'll know very well the diversity of experiences that we're trying to support. I said previously that the heart of what we do really is in the hubs, and that's where the collaboration happens at a local level. And this tells you, broadly speaking, why that's so important. Hubs exist in themselves to help the partners in that locality do together what they can't do alone. And people only come to those hubs because it adds value to the work they do. Schools can do great things without working with others, and they can do much better things when they work with others as well, whether that's sharing good practice or sharing the costs of an investment or whatever it might well be. But the same is true then in those larger networks, where schools get to talk with colleges, or schools in different phases work together, or hear from military partners or charities who can provide support. And that's what this conference is really about. But it's also worth saying that the hub network does what the hubs individually can't do together. And that's where the practice or experience of an individual school in an individual place across the country can feed up to a policy change at national level. And I think that's where the power of the Alliance really comes into its own. The other kind of things we do is to try and gather the best of practice that there is across the Alliance, and turn that into simple ways to change and improve what we're doing to support service children. And so one example of that, which you'll find on our website, is the work we did on Listening to Learn, the Voices of Service Children, in which you'll find a number of case studies of the range of partners. So that means local authorities and schools and charities, universities, loads of different people who are spending a lot of time trying to think about how can we listen well. It's that diversity, that smoothie of experiences that I described earlier that makes listening so important. And also the values that we hold as an alliance make it so important that the voices of service children are not only listened to, but acted upon. So I just commend that report to you. It's quite simple to access, and there are some simple themes here which I want to just touch on. Listening is important because of that diversity, like I've said, but it's also important because of inclusivity. One of the things that we know from a range of different bits of research is that service children are at risk of not being included, of not feeling part of the communities in which they become part of or move between, and in some cases are more likely to experience bullying or not feeling part of those communities, and some of the evidence we have from places where there are some very large populations of service children. So it's really important that we listen, because it helps inclusivity, it helps service children to feel like they're included. But I think perhaps one of the most important things, and something which is very easy to forget, is that we really want change as a result of listening. And transformation is another good reason to listen. Not just because the listening process allows us to understand service children and their needs better, but by acting on the things you've heard, we can empower young people and give them a sense that that we care about their lives, and we can see their engagement in their lives and in school life improving as a result. So there's 3 really good reasons to want to go about listening in a really good way. And 4 principles you can draw upon to do that are listed here, and they are the outcomes of that report. Be deliberate about your listening. Make time for it. It's something you have to do deliberately. It doesn't happen accidentally. There are loads of different ways of doing it, but we have to take it seriously and act deliberately. Be open. That means open to surprises about what might come out of the listening, providing lots of different ways to engage, so that not the same voices or the loudest voices are the ones that are always heard. Be child-centered, and a really good example of what that looks like in practice is letting children set the agenda. We are parents, and in some cases corporate parents, and we have responsibilities obviously to be the adult in that relationship. And so we're often making decisions that are in their best interests, of course. But it's also the case that if we can be open, then we can also make space in the agenda to make sure that we're not setting all of the terms of that discussion, that children themselves can raise the things of concern to them, so that we can respond to what really matters to them. And I think we'll find often that we'll be surprised. And ultimately, and most importantly then, being willing to change. Like I've said, you have to start the process with a commitment that you are going to change as a result, because they will say things that will require us to do things differently. And I think we have to start the process by being committed to want to change as a result. And doing that, we've seen in the case studies some really excellent practice and improvements in outcomes. So I commend that to you. It's a really good example of the kind of thing the Alliance cares a lot about. The final thing I want to do is just invite you to start talking to one another. So I know that's a really a quick summary of the 4 Ds of service children's lives. Let me encourage you to take advantage of the website, where you'll find some research briefings. So one thing we really I think is very, very important to us is that we are the conduit between what can be very difficult to access or difficult to understand, or sometimes not entirely translatable research evidence into something which is easy to apply. I remember thinking as a teacher that I really cared about what the best evidence was for how I go about supporting the children that I care about, but just simply not having the time to engage with it. And so much of the work I've done in the last 20 years since leaving the school setting for other settings has been focused on trying to translate research into meaningful practice. Essentially, that's what characterizes a lot of what the Alliance does. So you'll find research briefings that do that really, really well in just 1 or 2 slides, a summary of what the research says about the mobility and its impacts, or a range of other things as well. So do have a look at the website to find that. And if there are areas where you think more research is needed, or where further briefings would be helpful, engage with a local hub, share your views there. You might find some of the answers are already out there. And if there aren't, then those kinds of needs get fed up through the hub network into the hub leads group, and we can identify some priorities and act on them. So we'd love to hear what your needs are and do something to meet them. The question I want to ask you, and before we have a reflection on what you've hear from your reflections overall from the session so far, is to spend 15 minutes in a discussion group. You'll be put into breakout groups to consider the 4 Ds of service children's lives: diversity, discontinuity, development, and disadvantage. And the question I want you to consider is, what personal experiences or observations have you had of the 4 Ds in practice? And it might well be that those are not only about service children's lives. Many people have found that the work that we've done has value, not only for service children, but for others as well. But ideally, yes, your experiences with service children, where have you seen these things in practice? And where have you seen the relationships that I've described between that smoothie of experiences and diversity and the discontinuity it creates? Where have you seen children really benefiting from those experiences, and how are you taking the best of that and sharing it with others? And where have you seen that disadvantage being realized? We'd love really to support you sharing practice with one another and getting something of value from that discussion. So I'm going to hand over to Jill to put you into breakout groups, and we'll hear from you back at 4:30.
Let's look at the 7 principles in a bit more detail. This is page 10 in the delegate booklet for this conference. It's page 5 of the toolkit itself. So we developed this framework in the research report into the Thriving Lives Toolkit. These 7 principles which came from the research. The toolkit enables schools to reflect on their practice, to identify improvement priorities through an evidence-based self-evaluation tool. It uses the research's 7 principles with the accompanying vision statements to lay out what effective support might look like. Those 7 principles are: Principle 1, our approach is clear. Leaders understanding an approach ensures resources and policies improve service children's outcomes. Principle 2, well-being is supported. Tailored pastoral provisions support service children's mental health and well-being. Principle 3, achievement is maximised. Teaching, assessment and support ensure the continuity of service children's learning and progression. Principle 4, transition is effective. Effective schools have systems and support in place to ensure seamless transitions for service children when they arrive and when they leave the school. Principle 5, children are heard. This is about having service children's diverse voices heard and informing the support that they receive. Principle 6, parents are engaged. Recognising the importance of strong homeschool partnerships which help service families feel valued as part of the school community. And Principle 7, staff are well informed. Underpinning everything is supportive training and networks, ensuring that all staff across the school understand and support each service child. It's really important not to view these principles as hierarchical. Principle 1 might be the starting point, but Principle 7, having well-informed staff, as I said, is critical to achieving the other principles. They're all key pieces of the overall jigsaw of what highly effective schools do to support the education and welfare of their service children through their educational journeys. We're now going to go on and look at one principle in a little bit more detail. So let's delve into that detail. As I said, this has had masses of testing and poring over the detail by the researchers, but also by many different user testers in our network. So it helps schools to have the confidence that actions they take, funding they commit, has a strong evidence base. This is page 11 of your delegate booklet, page 6 of the toolkit itself. Each principle has a page like this, setting out the evidence, what that might look like with some examples of what that says, what that is in schools. What are schools doing when they approach this, when they do this approach very well? How the self-assessment is structured as well. So what you have in front of you here is Principle 1, about a clear approach. The blue principle. Evidence suggests that it's really important to have strong embedded policies and a planned and transparent approach to support and to funding and really careful monitoring. Effective schools have clear strategies for securing, deploying and evaluating dedicated funding. They involve the whole school and strategic roles like governing bodies, and they ensure service children's voices not only permeate but also strongly inform strategy. There's more on that in Principle 5. On the following page, the user will be asked to rate themselves as either emerging, developing, or embedding. And you can see on the bottom right here, emerging practice, just reflecting and implementing some actions, developing, making strides in addressing the question, but yet to embed it in regular practice and evaluation. Or are they embedding? Have they got a program of established, monitored, evaluated work showing evidence of impact? So let's go on and have a look at that next page. This page of the toolkit provides those reflection questions which came out of the research, which school leaders can use to review their own school practice under this principle. Let's have a look at how it's put together. You'll be prompted to consider your current practice, to read the question, think about what evidence do we have in our school. You might want to start off by looking at the middle 3 columns there, reflecting on the extent to which you feel your school is emerging, developing, embedding, and record any evidence for that judgment. And then there's also space to put down some agreed actions and some deadlines. The Alliance's pilot of this self-evaluation framework included partners across the UK, and the questions were designed in such a way that they're applicable to all schools at different phases, regions, different development of service child support, different numbers of service children. The questions for Principle 1, our approach is clear, that you can see here, prompt reflections around whole school awareness, monitoring, evaluation, embedding the voices of service children and families, governing bodies, and policies such as admissions. The toolkit then goes on to present similar evidence and opportunities for reflection and planning for each of the other 6 principles. And the rest of the conference is going to look at some of the support available and different aspects of the different principles in more detail. I'd like to just finish by just going through the values that underpin this toolkit. Partnership is fundamental to the Alliance's existence. It's also a commitment to a way of working. It doesn't mean avoiding problems or ignoring issues, but it challenges us to focus on solutions, to never problematize children themselves. Like all children, service children have huge potential. Their experiences provide wonderful opportunities to thrive, and so the toolkit does prompt us to look at both of those sides. We can never know everything we need to know, but combined with well-informed professional judgment and an unrelenting focus on the child, as I've said, a really sound evidence base helps to provide a foundation on which service children can thrive. Thank you for listening. I look forward to connecting with you today in the breakouts or in the Q&A in the conference, so please do get in touch.